From threat to opportunity. Why Canadian heavy oil producers should eye Venezuela. The conventional narrative around Venezuela's potential oil resurgence paints it as an existential threat to Canadian heavy crude producers. We're told that when sanctions lift and production ramps back up, Venezuelan barrels will flood U.S. Gulf Coast refineries, undercutting Canadian market share and eroding our pricing power. I'd like to flip that script entirely. The real opportunity. Canadian expertise meets Venezuelan reserves. Here's what the hand-wringing overlooks. No one in the world knows heavy oil like Canada. Our engineers cut their teeth on some of the most technically challenging extraction and upgrading operations on the planet. In fact, many of the Venezuelan petroleum engineers who built the Orinoco Belt industry in the 1990s and 2000s ended up in Fort McMurray when their own industry collapsed. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, 303 billion barrels. But decades of underinvestment and mismanagement have cratered production from 3.4 million barrels per day to barely 1 million currently. Rebuilding that infrastructure will require over $100 billion in capital, and more critically, the specialized heavy oil expertise that Canadian companies possess in abundance. Why this makes strategic sense. 1. Turn competition into partnership. Rather than watching U.S. majors monopolize Venezuelan reconstruction, Canadian producers could position themselves as technical partners and operators. We have the proven track record, the specialized equipment, and the workforce that understands heavy crude extraction at scale. 2. Geographical and technical synergy. The bitumen in the Orinoco Belt is virtually identical to Alberta's oil sands. Canadian companies already operate the equipment, understand the processing requirements, and have refined the technologies needed to make Venezuelan operations economically viable again. 3. Market diversification. A Canadian presence in Venezuela provides strategic diversification beyond our traditional dependence on U.S. markets. With Trans Mountain now operational and Asian markets hungry for heavy crude, Canadian companies with Venezuelan operations could serve multiple markets simultaneously. 4. First mover advantage. If regime change or sanctions relief creates an opening, the companies that establish operations early will secure the most favorable terms and premium acreage. History shows that brownfield redevelopment rewards early entrants. 5. Counter the China footprint. Chinese companies have been Venezuela's primary customers during sanctions, purchasing heavily discounted crude. A Canadian presence would provide a democratic Western alternative that aligns with broader geopolitical interests of our allies. What would this look like? Rather than viewing this through a zero-sum competitive lens, imagine joint ventures between Canadian producers and a reformed Venezuelan state oil company, bringing operational excellence and governance standards. Technology transfer agreements that leverage Canada's SAGD, CSS, and upgrading technologies. Technical service contracts that deploy Canadian expertise while managing political risk. Training programs that rebuild Venezuela's petroleum workforce with Canadian know-how. Infrastructure partnerships that modernize Venezuela's badly degraded pipeline, upgrading, and export facilities. The challenges are real but manageable. Yes, political risk remains high. Yes, Venezuela's legal and regulatory framework needs fundamental reform. Yes, expropriation history creates legitimate concerns. But consider, Canadian companies successfully operate in challenging jurisdictions worldwide. We understand sovereign risk management, have experience with resource nationalism, and can structure agreements that protect shareholder value while respecting host country interests. The key is timing, partnership structures, and patience. A call to strategic thinking. Instead of bracing defensively for Venezuelan competition in our traditional markets, Canadian producers should be asking, how do we participate in Venezuela's reconstruction and turn a potential threat into a growth opportunity? This isn't about abandoning Canadian operations, it's about extending our heavy oil leadership globally. About leveraging 2 decades of technical innovation and operational excellence to capture value in one of the world's most underutilized petroleum provinces. The companies that recognize this opportunity early, build relationships with stakeholders, and position themselves for eventual entry will be the ones that thrive in a post-sanctions Venezuelan oil landscape. The question isn't whether Venezuela will come back online. The question is whether Canadian heavy oil producers will be passive observers or active participants in that transformation. What's your take? Is this an opportunity worth exploring, or are the risks simply too high? I'd love to hear perspectives from others in the industry.